Hello everyone. In this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow up the video about patterns and beauty and how to use those things for design and specifically look at architectural examples. So I've pulled a couple pictures of famous architectural projects that can sort of pull out a specific symmetry that I talked about in the last video. That is a good example of it. And we'll just look at it and see how it relates. The reality is all the projects we're about to look at, they exhibit many of the symmetries. And if we remember, what I argued was that patterns are the key to beauty, and patterns are really just a collection of symmetries. And if you understand it, it can be sort of simple to break down, but you'll see from these simple tools, you can really create great and varied design. So let's go take a look.
All right, in this first example, of course, here I have the Taj Mahal, which I think is just about the best example you can have for mirror symmetry or reflection symmetry, which of course is the symmetry that is most often thought of when you think of the word symmetry, although as we learned in the previous video, there are other definitions mathematically to what symmetry means. And it's set up on an axis, and one of the really interesting things about this building is it's really more than a building. That's what I'm trying to say. And you can see that in this photo, that it goes all the way to the site. And the main axis right here is already defined right through the building, right through the dome, and right through the landscape. Sort of missed it there a little bit, but it's truly a perfect symmetrical building. And I'm just going to sort of highlight this as we go. Um, One note as I'm sort of drawing here, usually somewhere on these photos, I did not take them. I give credit to the location where I got it and the photographer up somewhere in this drawing. So here it's in the top left. So I won't point that out for every drawing, but I just did want to know that. So when I highlight this, you can see it's amazing how all the elements are there, from the building to this site elements and everything else. And I think that sort of interesting thing to note here too, which I think is valuable, is not only is there a holistic symmetry, but each little component is symmetrical about itself. So if you look at this piece here, for example, it has a axis of symmetry there. You can put little arrows on it, and it appears over here as well. Same thing. I won't highlight it at all, but it's right here. And then, of course, little towers themselves, they're each symmetrical about themselves as well. So there's the whole symmetry, and then there's the pieces of symmetry. And of course, when I'm using symmetry here, I am using it to mean mirror symmetry or reflection symmetry. But I should note, and we're going to see other examples that really highlight these other symmetries better. There are other symmetries besides mirror. There's scale symmetry, and we really see that here a little bit in the domes. There's this big one, but really it's a replica on the small scale there. There is repetition or rhythm, and so we see like these little arches repeat at different scales, the domes repeat at different scales, little arches in there, and so there's the same shape repeating over and over again. That creates the rhythm. Even down here, there's a bunch down here. So even though this I think is a really great example of mirror symmetry, it really contains many of the others, and it's the collection of all of that stuff together that creates this pattern of design that really comes through in a very beautiful way. So there's the Taj Mahal. Pretty interesting. And this example I pulled out because I wanted to talk a little bit semantically about symmetry, because for St. Basil's Cathedral here, I think some people might be tempted and to call this not symmetrical of a building. And the floor plan itself is semi-geometrically regular, but then its outcropping in sort of 3 dimensions certainly isn't, and definitely the angle that this photograph happens to be taken at sort of enhances the fact that it's not a perfect mirror symmetry on the whole. But you know what? I think when you look at the word symmetry, I don't like calling this asymmetrical, or the theory is like, well, I don't like symmetrical buildings, because I think what it does is it artificially changes the word symmetry to mean it must A, absolutely be perfectly symmetrical, and B, not count any of the other kinds of symmetry that might exist. And so I want to look at those really briefly with this example in two different ways. So first of all, if you're going to use symmetrical to only be perfectly asymmetrical, then I want to hold you to using the word asymmetrical to be perfectly asymmetrical. And that would mean that most everything exists in the middle. To me, that's not a very useful argument. I think there are different ways of looking at things. It's not uncommon for people to actually see a scale of symmetry, especially when you're looking at certain scientific studies and things that may say things like, well, this face of a human is more symmetrical than that face. I think that's a much more sophisticated way of looking at it, that there are levels of symmetry, and that just because it's not perfect does not mean it's asymmetrical, which would mean in theory perfectly asymmetrical. So yeah, this building isn't perfectly symmetrical on a mirror basis, but there are some levels to it. It certainly is on a mirror base, not totally there, because we can see how the domes are different on each side purposely, I think, to provide interest, and that's good. That said, there's the second definition of symmetry, which is not just mirror symmetry, that there's rotational, there is scale, there is repetition, and all of those, and those all are clearly here, right? I mean, we see rotation in the domes, and we see a repetition of the basic form. Even like, it might not be the exact same thing, but there's a scale difference between these guys. So all those other things exist maybe more clearly than reflection symmetry, which makes it symmetrical, right? And I think the idea here is that, going beyond to get to the sophisticated level of defining patterns in architecture, and any design, it's not just about the pure symmetry. It's complexity and even imperfection actually go a long way to making something really quite interesting. I still think it's symmetrical, even in its base form, even if not perfect, and it's a collection of all those types that add up to be something really interesting. There is a unified design here, and that makes it symmetrical. It does not make it asymmetrical. Asymmetrical things are hard to do. They are probably less attractive. Actually, symmetry is so built in our world that creating something perfectly asymmetrical, I think, is nearly impossible. Um, and so it's just a matter of what symmetries are you doing and how you're exploring them and how you're playing off of them for yourself. And I think that more sophisticated way is more truth to how an object behaves in the world, be it a building or anything else that is designed. And so I think St. Basil's Cathedral is sort of an interesting example of how things don't need to be perfect to create pattern and really be really quite interesting. And you clearly get a sense of these towers and these domes, and then the little detail in here is really quite fabulous. So that's the lesson we can learn from St. Basil's Cathedral. I'm going to move on to the Pantheon. And this one, I think I'm using as an example of rotational symmetry, although there's, again, many other kinds of symmetries in here. One thing I find interesting is that, there's very rotational symmetry is probably one of the least used symmetries in architecture. I mean, architecture tends to be square, uh, for a variety of reasons, just historically. You do see it sometimes in things like this, like domes is probably the best place to see it. Maybe some detailing like in arches or in rosed windows, but it can be really quite beautiful design as I'm sort of sketching out all the little pieces. And basically, rotational symmetry is just taking an object and rotating it around a center point. Of course, it doesn't have to be perfectly around a whole 360 of a circle. This dome, of course, is, although the photograph can't capture it all, but it sort of spreads out in that direction. Of course, this symmetry really does come down all the way down through the middle band, but all the way down to this lower band as well, with the columns and everything else creating this rhythm as well. And so I think, again, just like we'll see in all the projects, this is a great example of rotational symmetry, about the oculus being the center point of that rotation. But this exhibits many other kinds of symmetry as well. So even the coffers here, they are sort of, they produce a rhythm because they're copied over again, but they're also, because of the nature of a dome, they also are scaled proportionally. That creates a nice harmony across the way here. So you've got scale symmetry, you've got rotational symmetry, and arguably it's a perfect circle. So there's also mirror or reflection symmetry as well in there. And you got the same thing down here. You got the nice rhythm of the repetition. Um, translational symmetry down there in the scale of the various elements from bigger columns to smaller columns and all the way down to little details that we go there. So you've got the richness of texture, you've got the harmony, you got all of those basic design principles all coming from those core symmetries as illustrated here in the Pantheon. Pretty cool building. Now I think one of my sort of favorite and I think underutilized or under discussed um, design principles or even symmetries, because it's almost the core symmetry I would argue, and that's translational. Translational, I know, is an interesting word. I think it's more complicated than it should be, but it really just means copy or repeat something. And I think in that repetition, you get um, you get rhythm if it's done well, right? And so here's the Sydney Opera House, which has this really great rhythm of these geometrical forms here. Um, and the reason why I say translation is sort of the really the start of all symmetries is because all other symmetries create a copy, right? Mirror symmetry is a copy, it just also flipped. Rotational symmetry is a copy, but it's also rotated. And scale symmetry is also a copy, it's just also scaled. And so at the base level, translational symmetry, which is just a copy, it's required for all of them. Of course, the Sydney Opera House doesn't just have a copy, that also does use rotation. We can see that there is a rotation in these elements here, right? So this one rotates up to here, and this one rotates up to here. Similarly, it sort of happens on this side. It rotates up and it rotates up. And of course, we can also see that along the way, it's also getting scaled larger each time. So it has scale and rotational symmetry to create this rhythm. But ultimately, I do feel that's what this is about. It's meant to sort of reflect the sails and these duplicate copies, and it just creates a nice rhythm, which of course makes sense because this is an opera house and rhythm is something that is a part of music um, as well. So I think using rhythm as a core design principle for the Sydney Opera House certainly makes a lot of sense. And it's the easiest thing to do. I mean, it's the basis of all patterns. Just copy something and then manipulate it in some way to create rhythm. It's yeah. Anyway, I think when I look at buildings through this lens, to me, it's the one that stands out the most. Rhythm and repetition, essentially just copying, is something that can make great architecture or great design holistically. So I think that works. That works great for this example. I know I'm moving pretty quickly. Obviously, I could study any of these buildings quite significantly, but I'm going to keep moving on to one of my favorite buildings, and it's just a piece of it. It's impossible to capture it sort of holistically like I'm doing for most of the other projects, and this is the Alhambra. Um, and I'm using it to talk about scale symmetry. Again, we saw scale symmetry in the other ones, but I always get this feeling like first of all, I think the Alhambra is a great example of patterns in general. Like if I didn't even talk about symmetries, if I just said, which I could sort of simplify, beauty in architecture is about understanding patterns and applying patterns. You look at this picture or any others of any of the other rooms of this building, and yeah, people would say, "Yep, that's a pattern. I understand what you're talking about." Right? So it's there, right? And so yes, it's got all those things. It's obviously got lots of repetition. Um, it's there for rhythm, like we just talked about in the last one. Um, so it's also symmetrical, like this picture is literally symmetrical in terms of reflection. So it's got all of those things just like everything else. But I sort of like the fact that it also has an interesting take on scale. Because for me, one of the, in the previous video, when I was talking about patterns, I showed one image of a fractal, which is one way of thinking about pattern. Particularly, it's a mathematical thing. You can look it up in other videos. But it really has to do about scale, that it's sort of it's a similar pattern at different scales the more you go down. And I find this building and other similar pieces of architecture, they tend to have almost a fractal quality about them, which is purely about scale, right? And there's other ways of doing scale for sure. And I also think that scale also deals a lot with texture. So if something has a lot of bumps at a small scale and a lot of bumps at a big scale, like this building does, it also has texture to it, which is really quite interesting. So for those reasons, I thought it was a great example of scale. And I'll just sort of show this quickly. If I start with this big or arch here, that's sort of the opening, and I'm going to simplify it. I'm not going to draw out, you know, every little thing here, but really that arch itself, to start with scale, obviously it's a collection of little arches, right? So a bunch of little arches here make up the big arch. So that's scale symmetry, right? But also I think there's sort of some implied idea of other scale of arches in here as well. So if I sort of go from the midpoint, there's sort of this main highlight of the arch that sort of sticks out a little bit. That's just a sort of starting of this little arch, but larger. And then really there is even a bigger one that sort of comes up here. Oops, sort of missed a little bit there. Might even undo that one. I ran out of space to draw, and that's what happened there. Okay, so we come up and we come down. We can see these arches sort of get slightly more pointy and pointy as you sort of go up to almost a triangle shape there. But it's also that morphing. We're going to look at that in a moment. But there's like levels of arches in here. I mean, I could do the same thing here. It's like you can almost look at this as an arch, but inside that you've got, of course, the little ones there on each side, and sort of a, I guess, a medium scale one there, right? So there's a bunch of, there's almost countless arches in here, right? And all these curves that sort of add up between, and they're all at different sizes that sort of add up to each other. And of course, the other circles and patterns. There's all that's disregarding the sort of plant or organic motif that exists in the little patterns here and up in the circle and up in this leaf pattern up in there and all of that stuff. That's also another whole set of patterns that is operating at all the symmetrical levels as well. But I just want to point out the fact that using scale at different sizes, just repeating the element at different sizes, can also work great too. So I think that's a great example for this scale symmetry. And the last couple, I have a couple more examples. Really what I've done so far in the examples that we've seen thus far, they are all the core symmetries that I laid out in the previous presentation, right? But there are other ways of looking at those symmetries besides just purely applying them in the most straightforward manner. And I know I'm calling those pieces of architecture straightforward, which is probably not quite true, but what I mean by that, it's like if it's mirror, it's a clear mirror symmetry, and if it's a scale, it's a scale command. Where here in Zaha Hadid's work, there's some repetition, and in fact, I think there's quite a bit of repetition in here. So, for example, when we got this shape here repeats itself. It's not perfect, and as I've said before, the secret ingredient is to do these things sort of with right balance of complexity and imperfection, that makes it really interesting. So there's these sort of wave-like shapes that exist. I think it's most clearly here, sort of on the right-hand side, but really that shape sort of exists over here too. Like these curves, they're complex curves that can't really describe very easily using words, but the shape of this curve is very similar to the shape of these curves, these sort of canary-like shapes. They're all related to each other in a way. And I think, when you get into this sort of computer-generated design, it can do these things that are harder for people to talk about, but really they're based, I mean, computer, as I talked about in the other video as well, it's like it's all mathematics, it's all patterns, it's all math. When you're using computers to create sort of shapes like this, what you're doing is you're creating a pattern, even if we can't describe it perfectly, or even if the complexity of that algorithm is hard to explain. The computer can do it quite well, and it wouldn't work on a computer if it wasn't pattern based, right? If these curves weren't related to each other in some sort of controlled way. And even though we might not be able to describe it, I think we can certainly see it visually. And that's what's happening here and this complexity. And of course we got the little detail as well. If I were to sort of look at this, that's about the curves, but just like anything else, like look at this pattern. I mean, the glass itself, the curtain wall, I'm just going to sort of sketch out all of these little, not all of these little things. There's clearly this rectangle pattern, this offset rectangle pattern that exists in here of these mullions. I just drew a horrible job drawing it because it's a little too small to draw with the line thickness I'm drawing, because really there's this perfect verticals that are coming all the way down, and you can see they're getting quite close, and then the horizontals just sort of stagger their way up, but it's a clear pattern, right? And that's what we have here. And I'd say, I love this building. I think it's really, really great, but there are other buildings that are sort of hard to talk about simply through the words of the simple patterns, but I think they do all have patterns. They all do have symmetry. So even someone like Frank Gehry, when he's designing his work, if you look at the Disney Opera House or the Guggenheim, there are a lot of similar curves and similar shapes and similar things happening in what seems to be a semi-kinetic form, but it's not. If it was, I don't think he was sort of more sculpture. I don't think he would think those shapes would be beautiful. And then the fact that he might have come to them organically without thinking about the shapes, and that's one way of getting here. You don't necessarily have to think about the symmetries if you let that express itself through you emotionally, because that's what this is about. It's about beauty. It can be understood through emotion. It doesn't have to be understood through this cold, hard science. It's just a way of explaining it this way, and teaching it is what I'm using. So I think, using complex computer algorithms like the one on the screen here works, or any other way can work to getting those patterns, even if you don't fully understand them. Maybe a little bit of your back of your mind, knowing that that's how it works, will certainly help, though. So it's a little bit of a aside there, and on that. But I got one more example here, which is the Farnsworth House. And the reason why I pulled this up, because clearly this is, a pattern, and it's got the main houses on this grid. And the reason why I wanted to talk about it is because in all the other examples, they were sort of where I talked about them clearly expressed of the architecture. But you can do a lot of this patterning through what I want to, you could call it a grid that it sort of exists here in this building. Right, so there's this grid I can draw, and the columns are partially on the grid in this building. Grid isn't the only way. I'm not a huge fan of the word grid, because grid sometimes just people take it to mean rectilinear, as it is in this building, but it could be a radial grid. It might even be an incommensurate grid, which is a mathematical term I'm not going to get into at this point in time. It deals with the golden section or other ratios like that. But I think there's also grander frameworks that you wouldn't necessarily call a grid, but are still an underlying geometry that defines the whole shape. So it could be like, I want a triangle, for example, or a hexagon or a pentagon. I showed like the pentagon in another of the house we designed on a pentagon. While there was a pure pentagon in it, much of the other shapes are based on a pentagon. That's not a grid, but it's a framework that's underlining the whole shape of the building, right? And so the grid is the simplest. Rectilinear grid like this is the simplest explanation of this. But all those underlying patterns or underlying geometries can be based off of patterns of any of the symmetries we previously talked about in any kind of interesting ways. And you start with the abstract framework, and then you build the objects around that. So that's what this project does. And we can sort of see that here. If I sort of connect the grid here, we sort of start missing the columns in the inside of the building. There's going to be a column back in there, and another one sort of back in here. And of course, this one's going to go off the page like that. And it sort of creates these planes of design. I think actually, let me fix this, because I totally missed that one up. If I were to, sometimes it's, talking and drawing at the same time is not the easiest. So that's probably more around the proper spot for that. It creates these sort of planes in here, and the whole building, of course, is broken up into this thing. So like that is a grid line, but it really defines the inside versus the outside on here. And then you've got this internal one, which sort of designates this internal core that exists in the building, and of course this edge out here, which is the edge of the outside of the house. And so this is sort of, I'm just showing planes that sort of go through as a way of highlighting the grid. The grid also exists in the opposite direction. So, the distance between here and here the same. So here and here, and then we're in perspective here, so it looks smaller, but really that distance is, the same sort of distance, and this distance is the same distance, which sort of makes it the grid. And the reality is, in this project, that's the big grid. I think that the thing about when grids are often used successfully is like this grid that I've sort of shown is not the actual design grid of the project. It's the structural grid of the project, but there's actually a smaller design grid, as often the case, and you can start to see it. The reason why I picked this photograph is because you can see it in the floor tile here on the little deck that they have here, and it's composed of these rectangles, right? And then, so there's a grid here. I'll just draw a couple of these out. That's really bad, but anyway, you can see I'll highlight one rectangle here. This small little rectangle here is the rectangle of the whole, right? So this deck is really a scaled up version of that small rectangle. So is the house behind it. The grid sits on pieces, irrational pieces of these. And so I actually find, structural grid, are important architecturally for many reasons, because you have to have a building stand up, of course. But a design grid can often be smaller. It can often be slightly different in shape, and it'll allow you to define not just the structure, but material elements, as in this case, room layouts and all these things. And I really would encourage, when using a grid, sometimes it's easy to be like, okay, let me not design on a grid. I'll make a floor plan, and then I'll come up with the closest structural grid that I can have to it, but I'll make exceptions where I need to make exceptions. And that's, I think it can be much stronger, can create visual pleasure, and even help the function of a building if you say, you know what, I'm going to start with a design grid, turn that into a structural grid, and as close as possible make my floor plan fit into that. Of course, there should be exceptions, because that's a key to it all too. But don't let the exceptions be the easy way out. Make them the important statements of the project. So design grids. I think this is a great lesson in design grids. I could go on and on about frameworks more and more, and some I might show some in another video, some examples of some other projects where I go into other ideas about grids and frameworks as well, because it is almost as complex as even these individual things, where I could go into so much more detail. But this Farnsworth house is a great example of grids and frameworks. It also shows all the other kinds of symmetries that the other projects do as well. And again, because that's what makes great projects, it's basically these simple geometric patterns added up together to create an interesting visual complexity, and knowing when to break it and when to stick to it and when to use other kinds of patterns is key. So hopefully these sets of videos will work together to make you understand architecture and design better, and be able to ultimately be able to apply it yourself better, right? Again, don't be afraid to be emotional about these things and sketch, and just put your feelings down on paper. But then as you go and translate it into finalized documents, use this knowledge to help make the building better. Okay. Thank you. Keep making great drawings.